It's about 1200 BC. In a town, Ramoth Gilead, up the north on the eastern side of the Jordan. It's about 300 years since they'd crossed the desert and moved into the land of Israel. So they're well settled and there's a good structure there. Society's there, everything's, well, as it should be. The scene is of the early morning, and as normal routine, the women are coming to the well to draw their water. History would have us believe that there was a lot of deep discussion go on around the well as the water was drawn up. And on this particular morning, you could just imagine, have you heard someone slipped up? Oh, there's a juicy tale to tell. Gilead, from Gilead, had been caught out. His mistress had become pregnant. And the name Gilead from Gilead probably says something. They were naming somebody from a region because they were relatively important. Could you imagine that today? We'd have Westy Wallsend Norris, Blacktown Williams. Oh, that says it all, doesn't it? So this is another time and place, but it's very important for us to, when we consider this, to remember that. We don't have the same ideologies or mores as they had back then. But what had happened was that Gilead had played up with one of the local girls and she bore him a child and he was married. It was interesting how she knew it was his, but never mind. So that is obviously a major problem in a community like this. But Gilead, to his credit, actually took responsibility for the child and took him into his own house. And as time went on, he must have reconciled, and his wife had several other sons. When they were young, it was probably not a problem. They'd just play down the backyard. But as they got older, there was tensions grow, and obviously at the time of Gilead's death, the tensions got out of hand, and the young boy was evicted. The name of the boy is the topic of this morning's talk, Jephtha. Now, I'll give you a little bit of background. Gilead is the area that when they crossed the desert and entered Israel, that was given to, we look at Joshua 22:13, it was given to Phinehas, the son of Eleazar, the priest. And the tribes of Reuben and Gad, and how they did it, I don't know, but half of Manasseh went there. So there was 2.5 tribes there. So it was a large region. And it was in this area that the whole region, it was mountainous, and I think the name actually stands for mountains. They're not quite sure of it. I couldn't find the answer to that one. So then Jephtha grew up in this region, and his name meant set free. So his father was Gilead from Gilead, and Jephtha was set free. He was punted by his brothers. I'd get you to look up Hebrews 11. We'll be spending most of our time here, so keep your finger in the place. I'll read... no, we won't spend most of our time here. But I want to read from Hebrews 11, and specifically verses 32 to 34. In it, Paul says, "And what more shall I say? For time will fail me if I tell you of Gideon, Barak, Samson, Jephtha, of David and Samuel, and the prophets who by faith conquered kingdoms, performed acts of righteousness, obtained promises, shut the mouths of lions, quenched the power of fire, escaped the edge of the sword, from weakness were made strong, became mighty in war, put foreign armies to flight." Now, Hebrews 11 is basically known as Faith's Hall of Fame. All of the people mentioned there, the men and women, were people that had demonstrated significant faith. And you look at the names, Gideon, Barak, you can tell I like this verse, they were my previous sermons. Samson, yep, we all know about him. Jephtha, okay. David and Samuel, Jephtha. We often don't remember much about him. Yet he got a whole chapter and somewhat more devoted to him. So there is a bit more to this personality. So we're going to have a look at the story. I'll get you now to turn to Judges 11. We're fixated on 11 today. And we'll look at 1 to 3. Jephtha 11, 1 to 3. Jephtha the Gileadite was a mighty warrior. His father was Gilead, his mother was a prostitute. Gilead's wife also bore him sons, and when they were grown up, they drove Jephtha away. "You are not going to get any inheritance in our family," they said, "because you are the son of another woman." So Jephtha fled from his brothers and settled in the land of Tob, where a gang of scoundrels, in the international version, gathered around him and followed him. Scoundrels. So I had to do some looking up. What defines a scoundrel? Other versions, worthless men. Now, which is worse, scoundrel or worthless men? But what these were much like Jephtha. They were people that didn't have an inheritance, and they gathered together to try and eke out an existence. Now, a band of likely young men. They didn't have football in those days, so they did the next best thing, and they sort of were a police force for hire, much like David was a little later when he was in his wandering stages. And so they used to look after towns and cities around them, and occasionally when the coffers got low, wander across the border to the enemy and beat up on some people over there and fill their coffers again. So they were not really as bad as what that said, scoundrels. The terminology, well, language. Let's go back a bit. If you turn back to Judges 10, we'll get the background to what happens next. It reads, "When the Ammonites were called to arms and camped in Gilead, the Israelites assembled and camped at Mizpah. The leaders of the people of Gilead said to each other, 'Whoever will take the lead in attacking the Ammonites will be head over all of Gilead. Okay? So you've got the Ammonites camping, wanting to take over the land with their army all there ready to go. The Gileadites had come out. They were sitting on the other side of the valley, no doubt, like they used to. And they had a look across and thought, ooh, right, we're not up to this. We need somebody else. So whoever comes and leads us against them will make the head of Gilead. Flick back to Judges 11 and we'll look at verses 4 to 11 now. Sometime later, when the Amorites were fighting against Israel, so it's some time, so they've obviously had a few losses, I would say. The elders of Gilead went to get Jephtha from the land of Tob. "Come," they said, "be our commander, so we can fight the Ammonites." That's a good offer, isn't it? Jephtha said to them, "Didn't you hate me and drive me from my father's house? Why do you come to me now, when you're in trouble?" The elders of Gilead said to him, "Nevertheless, we are turning to you now to come with us to fight the Ammonites, and you will be head over all of us who live in Gilead." Jephtha answered, "Suppose you take me back to fight the Ammonites, and the Lord gives them to me. Will I really be the head?" Well, he didn't trust them. The elders of Gilead replied. Now, it's quite funny. They'd already made the commitment to make the person head over of all of Gilead, but they offered him basically the head of the army. Not quite what they planned. So they fell back onto their fallback position and said, yes, the people made him head and commander over them, and repeated all the words before the Lord. So they made an oath and a promise that he would be the head. So Jephtha then goes and builds up the army a bit, probably brings some of his scoundrels across. And they start to look a little bit more formidable. But this is the interesting part. He's just been contracted, I suppose you would call it, to lead the army and afterwards lead the country. So he goes in all ready for battle, but what does he do? He negotiates. Sends a message across to the king of the Ammonites. What are you doing here? And the king of the Ammonites says, oh, well, we've come to get back the land that you stole from us. So then Jephtha sends back a pretty good history of what had happened. Israel hadn't conquered them. Israel had gone around the lands. They'd asked for a pathway through, but they were denied, so didn't even try to take them on. Simply went around the countries. And then they got to the last one, which was the Amorites. And they were told, no, and what's more, the army gathered and they attacked the Israelites, and the Israelites beat up on them really badly and basically wiped them out. The Amorites had several centuries before been defeated by the Ammonites. Yeah, they were big on names. So the Amorites were the ones that beat up on the Ammonites. They got wiped out by Israel. Ammonites grew back, and of course now we're wanting Israel's land. And so Jephtha explained, no, your history's all wrong, go away. And then he, to end it all, was very interesting. He says, you can have whatever Chemosh, your God, will allow you to have. If you're wanting it, come across and possess it through him. which was an interesting way of rubbing his nose in it. So, what happened then? They went to battle. Now, this is where the story gets really interesting, because at this point, Jephtha has been guided by God to the point. He was a man that, even though he was a scoundrel, was very committed and obviously knew his history. But then in 29 to 33 we read, "The Spirit of the Lord came on Jephtha. He crossed Gilead and Manasseh, passed through Mizpah of Gilead, and from there he advanced on the Ammonites. Standing on the brink, he looks across, and Jephtha made a vow to the Lord. If you give the Ammonites into my hands, whatever comes out of the door of my house to meet me when I return in triumph from the Ammonites will be the Lord's, and I will sacrifice it as a burnt offering." Then Jephtha went over to fight the Ammonites, and the Lord gave them into his hands. He devastated them. 20 towns fell to him, from Aurora to the vicinity of Minnith, as far as Abel Keramim. Thus Israel subdued Ammon. I go back to, he had been guided by God, led to the point where he had absolute authority over the group around him. He'd been promised victory. And just at the brink, he goes, "Hold on a second, I'll make a deal with God." A bit of a mistake, because a deal is, if you do something, I do something. That's not the way it is with God, is it? We can do whatever we want, but it's still up to God. So he really makes a mistake in doing it. And I've done a lot of reading over what happened here, and I'll relate some of it later. But basically he says the first thing that comes out of his door, he'll give to God and sacrifice. So he turned his back on the history, like Israel had conquered them all before. He had received the Spirit. Remember back in 29 it said, "The Spirit of the Lord came on Jephtha, and yet he still fell into making a deal." There was no need to bribe God. It should have just been, do it. And the aftermath, annihilates the Ammonites, returns home, and in 34 to 37, when Jephtha returned to his home in Mizpah, who should come out to meet him but his daughter, dancing to the sound of timbrels. She was his only child. Except for her, he had neither son nor daughter. When he saw her, he tore his clothes and cried, "Oh no, my daughter, you have brought me down. I am devastated. I have made a vow to the Lord that I cannot break." She replies, "My father, you have given your word to the Lord. Do to me just as you have promised, now that the Lord has avenged you of your enemies, the Ammonites. But grant me this one request." She said, "Give me 2 months to roam the hills and weep with my friends, because I will never marry." We'll come back to that a little later. What happens after? And this probably helps us understand a little bit more about the society of the time. In Judges 12, 1-7, this is after the victory. They'd claimed a lot of land. It reads, the Ephraimite forces, Ephraim being another tribe of Israel, were called out and they crossed over the Zaphon. They said to Jephtha, "Why did you go to fight the Ammonites without calling us to go with you? We're going to burn down your house over your head." Jephtha answered, "I and my people were engaged in a great struggle with the Ammonites, and although I called you, you didn't save me out of their hands. When I saw that you wouldn't help, I took my life in my hands and crossed over to fight the Ammonites. And the Lord gave me the victory over them. Now why have you come up today to fight me?" Jephtha, they then called together the men of Gilead and fought against Ephraim. The Gileadites struck them down because the Ephraimites had said, "You Gileadites are renegades from Ephraim and Manasseh." So, cast-offs. The Gileadites captured the fords of the Jordan leading back to Ephraim, and whenever a survivor of Ephraim said, "Let me cross over," the men of Gilead asked him, "Are you an Ephraimite?" If he replied, "No," they said, "All right, say Shibboleth. If he said Sibboleth, they killed him, and along with 42,000 others. Interesting, if you know some of the history of the Second World War, the Dutch used that same strategy for the Germans. A town that you and I would call Brooklyn, if it's said in Dutch, the Germans just can't do it. And so that's the way they were picking up the German spies. So it's been around for a while. So we reached the end of the wars, and Jephtha led Israel for 6 years. And then Jephtha the Gileadite died and was buried in the town in Gilead. So that's the story we had from the Bible. We prefaced that with Jephtha was a member of the Hall of Fame of faith. Now, I said this was a conundrum, and that's because when you start reading a little bit more widely, you come up with some interesting things. And I will read from rabbinical literature. So this is the hierarchy of the church and what they wrote about this era. Jephtha is represented by the rabbis as an insignificant person. That vain men gathered around him was an allusion or illustration of the proverb that of the sterile date palm associates with fruitless trees. His name being mentioned in connection with Samuel's shows that even the most insignificant man, when appointed to a position of importance, must be treated by his contemporaries as if his character were equal to his office. He is classed with the fools who do not distinguish between vows. He was one of the 3 men, or according to other authorities, of 4 men who made imprudent vows. But he was the only one who had occasion to deplore his imprudence, according to some commentators, among whom were Kimi and Levi B. Gershom. Jephtha only kept his daughter in seclusion. But in Tag, really academic stuff this, to Judges 11:39 and the Midrash, it is taken for granted that Jephtha immolated his daughter on the altar. which is regarded as a criminal act, for he might have applied to Phinehas, the high priest, to pay him some money to get out of his vow, but he was too proud to do that. So they wrote about him in pretty derogatory terms, and this is a history, so we can't just dismiss it as hearsay. It's documented. So much so that a little later it says, as his daughter lay on the altar ready to be killed and burnt, my daughter, my vow was, whatsoever cometh forth of the doors of my house. She answered, but Jacob too vowed that he would give to Yahweh the 10th part of all of Yahweh had given him. Did he sacrifice any of his sons? His daughter then declared that she would go herself to the Sanhedrin to consult. So, what's going on here? We've got this personality who's been put in the list of the great men of faith. The image of him sacrificing his daughter, who, from what we can make out, would have been maybe 13, 14. Then I read on a little further, and there might be a bit of an understanding why they wrote this. It referenced the 42,000 Ephraimites. So maybe they were Ephraimites that wrote the story. But if we go back to the biblical, it doesn't really give us an indication of what happened to the daughter. As I said, there's two camps. There's the one that he sacrificed his daughter, literally, and the other that says in the middle of that text, where it says, and offer as a burnt sacrifice, that and can be replaceable with or. Yeah. So, we will have to consider that one. So, the idea of faith is an interesting one. Christ, in Mark 4:40, challenged people, or the people he was talking to. He said to them, why are you so afraid? You still have no faith. So if we look at that, why are you afraid? You still have no faith. That's difficult. So is it okay to be afraid, even if you've got faith? And I'll go back to some of those characters from the faith list in Hebrews 11. Barak and Gideon. We know Barak, had lots of faith. But when it came time to go into battle, he wasn't going to go unless Deborah, the prophetess, went with him. So he balked. Gideon, no, I need you to show me. So he put the fleece out not once, twice, to be convinced before he would go off to battle. So Jephtha being afraid is probably not, out of character of being a human, because they're asked to go and do some pretty bad things. Now, the only difference between Jephtha and those others is he then went and said, if you, I. And that's probably his only downfall. But in the end, he still went ahead and did what he was asked to do. So he himself showed a huge amount of faith. But it was interesting to read in some of the writings, the ancient writings, that they mentioned the fact that his daughter was so willing to submit to the commitment that her father had made to God, that she was willing to go along with it. Now, that doesn't normally happen in a household that doesn't serve who they believe was God and what he wanted. There was a relationship made between what was happening there and what was happening with Abram and Isaac. So, did the daughter develop that faith in a vacuum, or was she in a household where it was demonstrated daily? So, what can we take from it? His faith is recorded in the Bible. So I think we can be relatively safe in the assumption that his daughter ended up being like Anna was, a worker in the temple. She never married. Now, why would that be distressing? He didn't have to kill her, but it was the total end of his line. No, she wasn't going to marry. So he was the end. And so what happened is that she probably went into the service of the Lord for the length of her life. And it was interesting that she asked her father for 2 months to go and wander the hills with her friends and mourn the fact that she wouldn't have children. That tradition was carried on for many, many centuries later. It's still heard of in Israel that the girls will go out to those hills and acknowledge Jephtha's daughter. So we have a man that was dependent upon God in the end. He made some mistakes. But what motivated him all of the time was that he did do what God asked him to do, and he did suffer for it in the end. And that's probably something that's more important than the memory of him making a rash promise and walking away from it with a loss. And it was interesting, if you continue to read what the rabbis wrote, they said he wasn't buried in a city of Gilead. He was so distraught after killing his daughter that he became diseased and his limbs fell off, and so they buried bits of him all over Gilead. I don't think so. I think they were Ephraimites. But I think the important thing to take is, yeah, we are human and we err, but the men of faith and the women of faith mentioned in that weren't immune from hitting the wall occasionally, but it's the fact that they went through the wall with that faith.